It's easy to think of Batman Arkham Origins as the black sheep of the Arkham family, and that's because it is. General consensus considers it the least of the bunch, and that's not just because it followed what many hold to be the pinnacle. Origins stinks of being a greedy cash grab, a mandate from the corporate overlords at Warner Brothers that the Arkham Goose lay another golden egg, ready or not.
Our beloved parent company, Warner Brothers, has decided to make a sequel.
What?
Well, actually, it's a prequel, which are often seen as lazy crutches for creating audience interest. Origins bears signs of rushed production, especially with how it recycles most of Arkham City's world map. The game introduces few truly new innovations to the series. At bare minimum, a good sequel should attempt to improve on the mechanics, design, and game feel, even if it has no fundamentally new ideas or aesthetics to explore. Arkham Origins is a step back in almost every way, though not a massive step back. Primarily, it's an issue of polish. Origins is littered with little design issues, little bugs and glitches that weren't there before. The environment design isn't as vibrant or memorable, resulting in a game that feels copy-pasted in the broad strokes. There are even issues with the game's core mechanics. Behind the scenes, it seemed like everybody got replaced. Original series developer Rocksteady was replaced by WB Games Montreal, a relatively new and untested studio. New actors were brought in to play younger versions of Batman, the Joker, and others, after Mark Hamill and Kevin Conroy had ostensibly retired from their roles. Unbeknownst to the public at the time, Rocksteady was working on an Arkham City follow-up. Today, we know those actors ultimately did reprise their roles, not only in Batman Arkham Knight, but also in various DC animated features. But back when Origins came out, this seemed like the new direction for the franchise post-Arkham City. For all we knew, the series had been permanently handed off to a new caretaker, and old talent replaced with new, presumably less expensive talent. In hindsight, Origins was merely a stopgap during Rocksteady's longer production cycle. Even though I don't think Arkham Origins is a bad game, it did damage to the Arkham brand. The Rocksteady games, Asylum, City, and Knight, each feel like distinct evolutionary steps, but Arkham Origins can easily be dismissed as derivative, just another Arkham game. Despite everything stacked against it, the game still possesses most of the strengths common to the series. The foundation is solid, and WB Montreal managed to build some unique strengths on top of it, even if it did mishandle others. Removed from the initial disappointment surrounding the game's release, there's a lot to appreciate about Arkham Origins, even if it's a less essential, less worthwhile experience than the others. If it were a truly bad game, I'd stop right here, because it wouldn't be worth saying much more. But the truth is, if Origins had been the first game in the series, it would be held in almost as high esteem today as Arkham Asylum. Origins can be seen as a bad game only by contrast to the others, and with the context of its status as a filler title. This is a good game, with some glaring issues. Despite all of the little nitpicky things that I'm going to complain about later, Batman Arkham Origins has a pretty stellar presentation throughout. As a piece of Batman media, there's a lot to like. Although it's not doing much that's entirely unique, what it does with style and aplomb. Origins goes for more of a film noir-inspired look and feel, rather than the grotesque gothic Halloween vibe of Arkham Asylum, and to a lesser extent Arkham City. That style works well to represent the early years of Batman's career when he's fighting more traditional organized crime. The muted color palette emphasizes light and shadow. It's a great complement to the darker Origins Batsuit, which I really think looks awesome in these environments and cutscenes. Batman appears suitably dangerous and scary here. Origins received its tremendous musical score from composer Christopher Drake, a veteran of many DC animated films, including the Batman projects Under the Red Hood, Year One, and The Dark Knight Returns. He's got a great Batman sound on lock, and there's no better evidence of that than the main suite, which plays over the game's starting menu. It's a wonderful exhibition of the game's style all by itself. That's right, I'm praising the menu. I'm not digging for compliments either. I mean it. The moving 3D stills capture the same sense of excitement and drama as great comic book panels. The way the images transition in time with the orchestral hits is a great touch, and this opening theme just gets me so excited to play. The strong presentation extends to the game's cutscene direction and voice acting. Roger Craig Smith turns in a solid performance as a younger, angrier, but also more vulnerable and fallible Batman. It was a thankless task taking over for the iconic Kevin Conroy, but it would be a disservice to downplay what Smith brings to the role. He's doing his own thing, but it's not so different from Conroy that you can't imagine this Batman maturing into the other. Martin Jarvis reprises his role from Arkham City as Alfred Pennyworth. This is the only game in the series that allows players to visit the main Batcave, and Alfred gets to be more than just a voice on the radio. Together, he and Batman have some of the most dramatic material to work with in the whole story. Troy Baker, fresh off his career-defining lead performance in The Last of Us, stepped capably into the Joker role. He was clearly asked to do a version of Mark Hamill's Joker, which is fine given the shared continuity. But since that performance is a more specific voice than Conroy's Batman, it kind of boxes Baker into an imitation or interpretation of another actor, instead of allowing him to fully flex his own creativity and capability. Fortunately, the writing for the character is just as solid as it was in the previous games. Joker gets some great scenes and lines. The Arkham series never kept a consistent actor for James Gordon. Gordon hardly mattered in the first two games. He wasn't a real character, and it was easy to forget about one of Batman's biggest allies altogether. Michael Gough steps into the role here. That's American voice actor Michael J. Gough, not the late British actor Michael Gough, who played Alfred in the Burton Schumacher Batman films. That's just a weird coincidence. Gough does a great job as the younger Captain Gordon, who finally gets a meaningful part in the story. After 2 games of increasing scale, we've finally made it to Gotham City proper. Arkham Asylum portrayed a small, isolated facility. Arkham City let you loose in a condemned neighborhood. Arkham Origins effectively doubles the playable area from the previous game. It's still only a slice of Gotham City, but that's more than enough canvas for the game's events. The map is split into 2 chunks, separated by a lengthy bridge. One of these neighborhoods is Old Gotham, the area that will eventually become the open-air prison of Arkham City. While it's easy to see this as a cheap reuse of existing assets and level layouts, I don't think it had to be. There was an opportunity to show more of a contrast between what this part of the city used to be and what it became by the time it was condemned. Several things work against that idea. For one, Arkham Origins and Arkham City are both set in the winter. It's much snowier in Origins, but in either case there's little plant life and natural color, which is not helped by the fact that everything happens at night. The big visual changes to Old Gotham are less striking than they should be. In keeping with the game's commitment to film noir flavor, this place is obviously not one of the nice parts of town, the parts that presumably don't need Batman quite so much. It's been in decline for a while, so the transformation from rundown neighborhood to open-air prison isn't as dramatic as you might expect. The general feel is quite similar. The city is largely monochrome with pools of gaudy neon and the occasional Christmas decoration, which is a nice touch. The presence of Gotham's citizens would have helped immensely to contrast this with the previous game. But, once again, there's an excuse for getting the civilian population off the streets. A severe winter storm has driven everyone but Gotham's criminals indoors, so the only people you encounter are gangsters and corrupt cops who will fight you just as readily. The Gotham of Arkham Origins is functionally not much different than Arkham City. It might as well be an open-air prison for the night. The new portion of the map, a neighborhood known as New Gotham, doesn't do much to distinguish itself. Again, this could have been a contrast to Old Gotham, but New Gotham doesn't feel substantially newer or more modern. There are some taller buildings, and the area is slightly less industrial, but there are still major industrial landmarks that dominate the cityscape. New Gotham has no distinct identity, like, for example, a central financial district, residential area, or slum. As a result, both parts of the map end up feeling anonymous and blend together in a kind of vaguely Art Art Deco malaise. There are nice details throughout the map, but they're easy to miss. The game doesn't know how to show off its best assets outside of cutscenes, and that makes the world seem more dead and generic than it actually is. A lot of effort and charm can easily go unnoticed in the normal run of play. The decision to have Origins take place in a winter storm is ultimately a detriment to the overall aesthetic of the game. The snowy haze lessens the overall contrast of the landscape. Buildings fade into the background quickly instead of piquing your interest with color, contrast, or well-defined shapes. When you compare similar scenes from Arkham City, it's apparent the former game has more dynamism and dimension to the image. There are deeper shadows and more vivid and dramatic pools of light and dark. There's more signage, more activity, and more life in this area as a prison than as a neighborhood. And when you compare New Gotham from the main campaign to New Gotham from the Cold Heart DLC, which has a different weather and atmospheric treatment, you see much the same. I'm not saying Origins looks bad. From a technical standpoint, there are aspects that look better than Arkham City, but an open world game should draw your interest around the map, and Origins doesn't do this nearly as effectively as its predecessor. The increased size of the map was clearly a technical hurdle for WB Montreal. Not only is the entire thing split in two, each neighborhood is further divided by massive buildings that you can't fly over. You have to go around them or through them. They serve a similar purpose as Arkham City's high walls, to ease the burden of loading and rendering on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 hardware the game was launched on. In Arkham City, those barriers made sense in-universe, but here, the barrier buildings are in the middle of what should be a contiguous city. They feel artificial and strange. Even worse, overworld traversal is hampered by changes to grappling. In Arkham City, it felt like as long as there was a structure above you, you could use the grapnel gun basically any time. That provided an amazing sense of freedom and mobility. Origins breaks this established rule by severely reducing the amount of grapple points in the open world. Whether this was a gameplay or technical decision, I'm not certain. In either case, it's a constant drag on the experience when navigating Gotham. Origins makes you do a lot of trekking across the city, including sending you back and forth across the long, boring bridge. It never feels like the game lets you get as much height or gliding speed as you'd like. Together, these literal and figurative barriers spoil the freedom that's supposed to be inherent to an open-world game. Was it worth all the hassles and compromises to have a bigger map? Wouldn't it have been better to have one well-designed, technically sound, and distinctly new neighborhood to explore, instead of spreading things out over a bigger, duller area? A bigger Gotham is one of those obvious back-of-the-box sequel features that WB Montreal probably felt they needed to have. But instead, an interesting world might be one of the biggest casualties of the game's rushed production cycle. Arkham Origins might have the cleanest narrative of the whole series, and that's thanks in large part to its simple, exciting premise. On Christmas Eve, 8 assassins have one night to kill Batman and claim a $50 million reward. This is a fun idea that once again provides a reason for Batman to face a variety of villains in a single night. Set 8 years before the events of Arkham Asylum, Origins stars a Batman still in the early days of his career. In tone and temperament, this is a different Dark Knight than we saw in the past 2 games. Younger Origins Batman feels rougher, more combative. This is teeth-gritting, axe-to-grind Batman, a Batman who feels utterly alone in his fight to take back Gotham from the criminal hegemony. All of this changes in the very story you play out. That's what Origins refers to. It's not a Batman origin story. This isn't Year One or Batman Begins. It's more like 2022's The Batman, an early days story about the already established character growing and changing. Older, wiser, rock-steady Batman is great, but those games shy away from portraying a flawed and fallible version of the character, which limits the dramatic possibilities. Whereas the Robert Pattinson-led movie revolves around Batman's philosophy and his perception of Gotham, Origins focuses on establishing character dynamics. Batman and Alfred, Batman and Gordon, and of course, Batman and the Joker. Younger, less experienced Batman is ultimately something the game tells you about instead of letting you experience through gameplay and progression. There's no real commitment to the idea and no major mechanical distinctions between Rocksteady Batman and Origins Batman. You still have almost all the same gadgets, the same support tech, the same fighting capabilities. Gameplay in Origins is a rehash of what came before, and it's not always a particularly exciting one. Arkham City pushed the gameplay forward on every front, making huge strides in world design, traversal, free-flow combat, and predator stealth. Arkham Origins has new ideas. A few. There are a couple of new enemy types, a couple of new gadgets, and a new stab at detective gameplay. But spread over the length of the whole game, those new elements don't go very far. They're not transformative of the experience like Arkham City's additions were. The upgrade tree is very linear and boring. There aren't many interesting choices to make at the beginning of the game. You're essentially forced to put points into health upgrades before you can get to the more advanced combat techniques. A lot of the most advanced upgrades are locked behind optional content and challenges, which are some of the least interesting parts of the game, and likely the parts that players will do last, if they do them at all, meaning the rewards will have little to no use outside of New Game Plus runs. WB Montreal had this tremendously solid base to build upon, and they didn't build much. Perhaps the best example of this is the glue grenade. It's a one-to-one functional replacement for Arkham City's Freeze Blast. Narratively, it wouldn't have made sense to have that in a prequel, since it's something Batman gets from Mr. Freeze 8 years in the future. I don't really care about the logic of when Batman gets his gadgets. Engaging gameplay matters a lot more. But there was an attempt to address the continuity by changing the gadget and including a little throwaway line in the DLC story about how the glue compound was unstable, which is why Batman doesn't have it later in the timeline. That's a silly continuity band-aid. It doesn't matter. What bothers me is that they could have done something entirely different. A whole new gadget with new uses and emergent possibilities in all modes of play. But that's something Origins is rarely able to provide. The best truly new gadget is the Remote Claw. The device can target 2 points and pull them together, or bridge gaps with wire, allowing Batman to create tightropes above enemies during stealth. You can tether enemies to overhangs at a distance, or pull them into objects and generally cause chaos, which is overpowered in a fun way. Although it removes some challenge from Predator encounters, there are other alterations that make up for that. Enemies that lay proximity mines do a lot to interfere with otherwise dominant strategies. The overall arena design and mixture of enemy types and numbers of enemies make this pillar of the game one of the strongest, even if it's not obviously different from what was offered by Arkham City. The most notable gameplay innovation is crime scene investigations. There is a little bit of this in previous games, identifying bodies or using forensics to track a target. Origins gives us full-on augmented reality reconstructions of crime scenes. It's visually impressive. The events are reconstructed around you. As you scan in more evidence, you gain the ability to scrub forward and backward in time and examine the event from all angles, looking for additional clues. For all the visual flair, it's still just window dressing. From a gameplay standpoint, all you do is look at things, scan them, and then listen to Batman be clever. You're not being clever, or even being fooled into thinking you are. These are interactive cutscenes. It's detective flavor only, but it's still a more engaging approximation than the last two games managed, and the mechanic is used sparingly enough that it doesn't get old. Free-flow combat is at the heart of the series' gameplay appeal, but Origins does nothing to improve on it. In fact, the system is slightly worse if you're a veteran of the previous games. The controls feel just a little less responsive. Sometimes it seems like button presses go ignored entirely. Batman is less mobile. You don't magnetize to enemies when attacking as easily as before. Your strikes don't reach as far, while enemy attacks seem to reach farther and make contact more often. Enemy attacks are faster than in previous games. If you and an enemy attack at the same time, the enemy will often beat you to the punch. The window for performing counterattacks is more strict, even though the indicator lights are roughly the same. Sometimes they don't seem to work at all, If you're in the middle of another attack, the game might not let you counter. This is especially irritating fighting large groups. You can easily find yourself in situations where you've barely got a break between enemy attacks to do something besides countering. Often, fights end up being dictated by the rhythms of the enemy rather than the player. This has been true of some boss fights and climactic moments in the series, but not usually the standard brawls. The problem isn't that it's more difficult or demanding, that's a preferential matter. It's a problem because the game doesn't clearly communicate the changes from the other games. Origins is speaking the same combat language as the Rocksteady games, but in a slightly different dialect. If you're fluent in Rocksteady free flow, then you'll be immediately comfortable with the general idea of combat, but you'll also be making little mistakes and faux pas that you might not had you learned the Origins dialect first. It's fine for Origins to experiment with changes. You can argue a preference for one or the other, but the visual indications haven't changed in a way that's clear to players in the midst of the action. So even though the game is performing as intended, it can feel like it's ignoring player inputs, and that's incredibly frustrating. I suppose you could argue that WB Montreal was trying to make Origins a more difficult game overall, and what's wrong with having that as their vision? Isn't that a good way to mechanically represent a less experienced Batman? That may have been the intention, and it would be a good argument if the game didn't totally trivialize its combat challenge 2/3 of the way through the campaign. Once you acquire the shock gloves, the brawling becomes a breeze. The shock gloves remove all barriers to attacking different enemy types. All you have to do in any given free-flow scenario is survive long enough to charge up the gloves, and then you can hit anyone with the strike button. Shield guys, armored guys, titan guys, enemies with guns, shock batons, knives. You just one button through all of them. As long as you keep moving and hitting the strike button, you'll win. It's fun to be overpowered once in a while, at appropriate moments, but the shock gloves remain a standard part of your arsenal for the rest of the game, and there's no downside to using them. This makes for a seriously bizarre difficulty curve. I can't imagine the fights toward the end of the game were supposed to be this easy. It's a really strange design choice. Every fight goes from being kind of a slog to a cakewalk. It reinforces the feeling that WB Montreal didn't exactly know what they were doing when it came to the free-flow combat design, or, more charitably, they didn't have enough time to balance and tune the game properly. On average, the level design and pacing in Origins isn't quite as streamlined or clever as the series' standard. Like the overworld, some of the interior spaces are redressed from Arkham City, and others have such a similar feel that they might as well be. The steel mill is a literal retread from Arkham City. This is the third time we've seen a version of this environment when you consider that it was the main setting of the Harley Quinn's Revenge DLC. Penguin's base of operations is a run-down cruise ship called the Final Offer, which is a valiant effort toward creating a memorable setting. There are some ornate spaces that give a hint of former glory, but a lot of the time is spent in run-down industrial spaces that don't feel particularly inspired or distinct. There are some real high points with the bosses here, but the actual level layouts just aren't that much fun to navigate. Blackgate Prison bookends the game as the first and final location. It's a significant landmark in Batman lore, being the place where the less extreme criminals are sent. Arkham Asylum is closed during this period of the timeline. The events of this game push Gotham leadership to reopen that facility to counter the city's growing supervillain problem. That's a little bit of a shame, though. It would have been neat to begin the game in Blackgate with the murder of Commissioner Loeb, and end in Arkham with Joker's prison riot. That would have fit thematically and tied this game back to the first in a natural way, but I understand why that might have been outside the scope of the project. As it stands, Blackgate isn't a huge contrast from Arkham visually or in terms of layout, but the Asylum already traded in so many different prison motifs that some amount of familiarity was probably inevitable. One of the most promising locations in the game is a Gotham City police station. To solve a murder case, Batman must infiltrate the building to retrieve some data. In the pre-Commissioner Gordon days, the GCPD is still thick with rot and corruption. Batman isn't yet on good terms with law enforcement. We're told Batman needs to complete this mission without getting caught, which ratchets up the tension. It's a neat idea that the game fails to take advantage of because it forces you into direct combat anyway. It's unavoidable. Mandatory stealth, and especially instant fail stealth, is often something mainstream games avoid because of how frustrating it can be. But the Arkham series has a whole suite of tested stealth mechanics built in. It's not like asking players to completely avoid enemies for once would be an unreasonable request. There's a similar mission in WB Montreal's follow-up game Gotham Knights. While perfect stealth isn't required, it is an optional challenge objective. Taking the stealth idea more seriously would have made this segment a lot more distinct, not just among the levels in Origins, but in the whole series. Declaring discretion important and then immediately backtracking on that kills the tension and excitement of the scenario. The pinnacle of Origins level design is the Gotham Royal Hotel. It's the most unique and lavish new environment in the game. A massive building with huge interior spaces, not an impossible structure, but an exaggerated, extravagant imagining of 20th century American urban architecture. For once, we get to experience a part of Gotham that reflects the city's great potential, that actually seems aspirational, like someone would want to live there, or at least visit. Seeing this place vandalized, turned into a twisted funhouse of sadism by the Joker, is a strong demonstration of the anarchic, chaotic new threat that faces the whole city. The unique space is used quite effectively. The way Electrocutioner falls down to the glass-domed lobby where Batman is, the way you transfer between the towers using the remote claw, the overview hanging bar that joins the towers. It's all well considered, and you end up with a good sense of the spatial relationships between these parts of the facility. You enter through the parking garage and work your way up the towers, transferring back and forth and climbing ever higher until the climactic confrontation at the top. Although so much of this game and the last take place in industrial spaces, the Gotham Pioneers Bridge stands out. As a feature of the open world, I kind of hate it. But as a level unto itself, it's one of the best. Bridges are major public works projects, monumental feats of engineering that lend cities a lot of their distinctiveness. Given that Gotham City is an important character in Batman's stories, making a notable feature of the city's infrastructure into a level is smart. What really makes the bridge special is how it plays with scale. The sheer size of the thing doesn't register when you're gliding over it. But there's a sprawling interior space concealed by the roadway on top of the bridge. Like Wonder Tower in Arkham City, the bridge cleverly mixes indoor and outdoor areas seamlessly, making it a more convincing and exciting environment to navigate. Of all the Arkham games, the side content in Origins feels the most like busy work. The bulk of it is classic open-world padding. Generic fights, repeated tasks, collectibles. There are network relays to destroy, murders to solve, crimes in progress to stop, and that old open-world standby, towers. Origins dumps Shiva and Deadshot, 2 of its promised 8 assassins, into the optional content, and fills out the rest with less worthwhile pursuits. There are some good moments, but the best bits require jumping through filler content hoops. My willingness to do optional content is proportional to my enjoyment of the core gameplay loop. The issues around free-flow combat and traversal mean it's harder to overlook the uninspired nature of the side content here. Most missions are structured around a particular villain and require you to complete a set number of repeating tasks before you take them down. Some of them include optional boss fights, but none of those are as fully realized as the main story bosses. There are slightly more difficult group fights that include one character with a bigger health bar and a couple of unique attacks. The Deadshot battle is the highlight of these optional bosses. It's a Predator encounter with the sharpshooter made extra challenging by his immunity to instant takedowns, and waves of henchmen that reinforce the ones you knock out. Some of the questlines feel interchangeable. Black Masks have you destroying drug caches, in Penguins it's weapons caches, and Bird's missions have you tracking down the source of Titan containers. Who's Bird? You know, Bird, Bane's lieutenant, that classic Batman villain. Mad Hatter is thrown into the mix again, but in a less clever, inventive, and surprising way than in Arkham City. I think developers like including him because it provides an excuse for a trippy sequence, but he's definitely not an interesting enough villain to be included in 3 of the 4 Arkham games. An actually new villain appearance for the series is Anarchy, a walking embodiment of Baby's first Batman critique, which does make him more satisfying to punch. His missions require you to reach bombs and disarm them within a limited time. It's a perfectly fine concept made a lot less fun by how annoying the city can be to navigate. And that's a persistent problem with the side missions. They'll have you going back and forth between new and old Gotham, constantly making you cross the bridge or use the fast travel system. You'll do a single fight or crime scene investigation and then be directed back across the river. I don't know if the side missions were the result of the compressed schedule, a lack of ambition or ideas or interest. The world is certainly filled out with stuff to do, but very little of it meaningfully explores or expands the world, the characters, or the gameplay systems. Though its side content struggles and its mechanical innovations are thin, Arkham Origins shines when it comes to the encounters with its assassins. Not all of them show up during the main storyline, but the ones that do provide stylish and varied fights. There's a clear ambition to try something new, an ambition that was harder to detect with the rest of the gameplay design. Even if it doesn't all work equally well, Origins has the best overall slate of bosses in the series. I'm not a huge fan of how the assassins are introduced, though. Batman finds intel about them after the Blackgate prison opening mission, and we get a cutscene showing them off. It's reminiscent of the widely maligned scene from Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, where Wonder Woman essentially watches teaser trailers for the Justice League in the middle of the movie. This isn't nearly so out of place, but there's still a sense that you're seeing a bunch of sequences that were made to look cool for marketing purposes. Keeping some of the assassins' identities a mystery until further in the game would have been more engaging. It would have been cool to find clues about them, keep players guessing. Maybe some could have remained a surprise right up until they attacked. But instead, Batman basically data mines his own game, spoiling the surprises that could have been. Killer Croc shows up before you even leave Blackgate prison. He's where Batman first learns about the assassins to begin with. His appearance would be a surprise, except that he's teased beforehand and comes so early in the game that the assassination plot has yet to be revealed. Croc's lair was one of the best parts of Arkham Asylum in terms of tension and atmosphere, but mechanically, it became repetitive and lost a lot of its potency. You never actually fought Croc there. The idea was that Batman wouldn't survive a direct conflict, at least not on Croc's turf, and that was part of what made the encounter so effective. At the time of Origins, Croc hasn't yet grown to such monstrous proportions, so Batman can take him in a more traditional brawl. This is early enough in the game that basic mechanics are still being tutorialized. The Killer Croc fight ensures players understand the beatdown move and how to manage fights with mixed strength enemy types, which will become common later on. It also introduces the concept of interrupting certain types of enemy attacks with quick-fired batarangs. It's short, sweet, and exciting. Beatdowns transition seamlessly in and out of unique animation states, lending a lot of extra energy and flair to the fight, even if it's not all that challenging. It's a perfect early game boss. Batman's encounter with Electrocutioner is one of my favorite moments in the entire game, and maybe the whole series. There's a big introductory cutscene where he threatens to kill Batman, then shock him back to life and kill him again. He talks tough, he looks dangerous. It's exactly like the build-up to any other boss fight. The game never lets on that it's going to pull a fast one on you. Electrocutioner doesn't attack. He waits and taunts, presumably trying to bait Batman into making a wrong move. But there are no wrong moves. There is no fight. It's a big fake-out, and I love it so much for that. Electrocutioner goes down in one hit.
Who wants to show me where the Penguin is?
This is the video game equivalent of that scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark, where Indiana Jones shoots the swordsman. The film builds up anticipation for a big fight, and then pulls the rug out. An elaborately choreographed fight was the original intention, but at the time of filming, many in the cast and crew were sick, including Harrison Ford, who suggested they shortcut the whole thing by just having Indy shoot the guy. According to one employee of WB Montreal, this parallels the production of Arkham Origins. The original plan for Electrocutioner was a full-fledged boss fight, which is probably why the cinematics are so fully realized. When that fight became another casualty of the game's tight schedule, the developers artfully turned lemons into lemonade. Some players bemoan the lack of a real fight. I don't agree at all. There are plenty of boss fights in video games, plenty in this game. We missed out on one boss in Origins and one more fight in Raiders. For me, it's hard to imagine either of those things would have turned out more memorable than what ended up in the finished products. In those cases, giving up a little bit of action yielded a huge return in the form of levity. It's important to sometimes subvert audience expectations like this. It gives a work so much personality. It's like how the Scarecrow sequences in Arkham Asylum played with player perception directly, and the game as a whole was so much more vibrant and memorable for it. The non-fight is quickly made up for with a real boss fight soon after, and it's the best in the game. Deathstroke is the closest Batman comes to fighting a peer. He's got a similar martial arts style, an array of gadgets and tools, quick reflexes, and high intelligence. He's the opposite of Electrocutioner, not a blowhard, but a competent mercenary who lets his work do the talking. If Mr. Freeze in Arkham City is the best boss fight in Predator-style gameplay, then Deathstroke is the best boss fight representing free-flow combat, a mode of play more about rhythm and reflex than planning and execution. Free flow is designed for fighting large groups, but what if, instead, you focused all that attention on one enemy who had a variety of abilities represented by those large, mixed groups? The fight looks great, too. Some bosses in the series are mechanically solid, but don't play out in a visually stylish way. Especially when dodging is the key to victory. They can look silly with Batman leaping and rolling all the time. The way combat looks is a big part of the series' appeal, and WB Montreal wisely understood that. They keep the camera more tightly controlled than most fights, which greatly contributes to the palpable intensity. It even inserts cuts and edits at times, making things feel faster, punchier. The fight is appropriately challenging, the most demanding in the game. You have to pay closer attention to timing your attacks and counters in a way that you normally don't and can't when fighting large groups. This is where Origins' more demanding timing windows begin to make sense and benefit the experience. It's a push-pull battle that lets you dictate the flow as much as it's dictated to you. It's a mode the Arkham games haven't really explored before or since, which is a shame considering how well it works here. Following up the best fight, we descend to Copperhead, the worst villain encounter of the main game. That's not to say it's bad mechanically. It's a perfectly serviceable piece of gameplay when it finally happens. The build-up is actually quite effective too, evoking the lead-up to Scarecrow's first appearance in Arkham Asylum. As you make your way through the steel mill, you'll be haunted by signs of her presence. She's stalking you, watching, waiting for her moment. It's creepy being a character who's normally the one striking from the shadows, being hunted by another, even more stealthy character. That part is great, that part works. Once Copperhead actually appears, the problems begin. Like most of the female characters in the series, Copperhead is overly sexualized, but she lacks any other dimension to distract or add to that characterization. Traditionally a male character, the developers gender-swapped a lesser-known villain to help balance out the cast. They were essentially creating a new character, and they could have done anything they wanted. What they wanted was a slinky, sexy contortionist.
We needed her to be contortionist and move in a really slinky, sexy way.
That choice belies an unfortunate attitude among the decision-makers behind the game. Unduly sexualized female characters are historically common in comics and video games, but by 2013, that attitude was starting to fall out of vogue. Even classic video game sex symbol Lara Croft got a sensible, practical redesign with the Tomb Raider reboot that year. In most other ways too, Copperhead fails to represent the game at its best. She poisons Batman, leading to a sequence of hallucinations and visions akin to Scarecrow's fear toxin in Arkham Asylum, or Batman's near-death experience in Arkham City. It's like those parts, but not as good. The visions feel uninspired. Once you know that they're happening, nothing about them is particularly surprising, emotional, or revealing. A hallucination of Alfred expresses disappointment in Bruce. That part works given the tension between the two in this story. The guilt over failing to save Commissioner Loeb and the bank manager is a lot more generic. I believe Batman would feel some remorse, but they use it as a cudgel to say he's not a hero, and I just don't think Batman is too concerned about that specific label. The fight itself is also a hallucination, at least partially. Copperhead comes at you with waves of doppelgangers. She attacks with sharp claws that act the same as knife-wielding enemies, making for a decently challenging and tricky battle. I'm honestly not sure if this fight is a metaphorical representation of Batman fighting against the poison, or if he's really fighting Copperhead. The latter seems like the implication, but it's inconsistent from how the poison is shown to affect victims, including Batman himself. He's struggling just to walk, but apparently he's able to fight off a master assassin under these conditions. It's either that, or Copperhead didn't take advantage of Batman's weakened state. Either way, it's one more thing about the character that's not handled well. The contrivance is obvious, and it cheapens the whole thing. One of the last bosses is also one of the least challenging. Firefly should be incredibly dangerous with his flamethrower jetpack combo, but instead, he's a chump. It's easy to stun lock him during large portions of the fight, whittling down his health by spamming glue grenades and batarangs. The lack of challenge is made up for by everything else. It's the most unique battle in the game. Apart from the final boss, the others are mainly melee fights. This one is gadget-driven, but more than that, it's set-piece driven, a sequence concerned with spectacle over difficulty. As a cinematic climax to the bridge bombing subplot, it excels. It flows well because it clearly telegraphs what's expected of the player as the fight transitions between arenas, minimizing the chance of irritating, unfair deaths to what are essentially quick-time events. Because the assassins are targeting Batman, this is the only fight in the game where it feels like he's fighting for Gotham. Since average citizens are mostly absent, the bridge, as a major piece of civic infrastructure, is a symbolic stand-in for the city at large, more than the hotel or any of the other locations visited. Despite the difficulty, the context of this fight gives it the biggest stakes for the city, but it's far from the most personal confrontation. If I asked you who was the biggest threat to Batman in a story about his first meeting with the Joker, who would you naturally assume I was talking about? Even if I knew it was a trick question, I wouldn't choose Bane. In terms of gameplay, and even plot, he ends up rivaling the Joker as the game's primary villain in a way that I'm not sure was intentional. You fight Bane 3 times, which is too much, frankly. The first fight takes place before Firefly, as the gameplay climax of the Gotham Royal Hotel segment. It's a pretty good boss, certainly better than the face-off against him in Arkham Asylum. It's broadly similar to the Killer Croc fight, but Bane has more moves and a much deeper pool of health. He hits hard as you'd expect. If you try to use gadgets against him, he says, "Men don't fight with toys." But then he uses his Venom delivery system to bulk up, because real men do use performance-enhancing drugs. After this, the Joker is caught, but Bane escapes and takes over as Batman's sole focus for a while. In tracking Bane, Batman finds out the mercenary has discovered his identity as Bruce Wayne, compromising his whole operation and endangering Alfred. Before Batman can return to the Batcave to ensure Alfred's safety, the Firefly bomb threat happens. While that's going on, Bane breaks into the Batcave, leaving it and Alfred in shambles. He's nearly dead by the time Batman arrives. We know he can't die here, of course, but that doesn't keep it from being an impactful moment. The scene doesn't need Alfred's mortality to actually be in the balance in order to demonstrate the importance of Bruce and Alfred's relationship. Violently taking away another parental figure is just about the most traumatic thing anyone could do to him. For a moment, we see Batman is scared and panicked as the criminals he haunts, giving him and the audience a visceral reminder of the risks of his chosen path. Batman uses the shock gloves to resuscitate Alfred, which is kind of dubious considering the nature of his injuries, but it's not the most medically questionable thing I've seen in a Batman story.
There's a vertebra protruding from your back. It has to be put back.
The scene that follows is great, with Alfred affirming Bruce in his work as Batman and urging him to finish the night's labor.
They need you. No. They need us.
This is a key moment of growth and change for both characters. Alfred's become convinced of Batman's importance, where he was more skeptically cautious before. Bruce has become convinced of the necessity of allies. He's begun to free himself from shouldering his burdens alone. As dramatically satisfying as these scenes are, Origins got there with a plot point that's obviously a big continuity problem. Bane also can't die here, and it seems unbelievable that he would hang on to the knowledge of Batman's true identity for 8 more years without acting on it. He doesn't seem to know Batman's identity in the other games, so Origins has to contrive a way to erase its own story beats. This is where the 2 additional fights come in, or maybe it's one fight broken up into 2 distinct phases. Bane 2 is a lot like the previous fight, but bigger, longer, uncut. It's fine, but it's so similar to the first, which was already similar to Croc. The scenario around the fight is what makes it unique, but I'll talk about that later. Bane 3, the true final boss, is very different. It's a stealth encounter inspired by the Mr. Freeze boss from Arkham City. Fully roided out on his TN1 compound, Bane is now completely invulnerable head-on. Regular stealth takedowns only do a sliver of damage. You have to use takedowns in specific spots to push him into electrified doors for more effective hits. Like the Mr. Freeze fight, the enemy learns from your tactics and tries to deny their continued use. Bane isn't nearly as good at that though. You can get away with using the same kind of takedowns, which is good because there are fewer available options overall. The arena is smaller and more confined. That ought to make it scarier, being trapped in there with this lumbering mass of muscles, and it kind of does. But by this point, Bane has far outstayed his welcome. The scenario is too artificial and arbitrary to feel properly threatening. WB Montreal had such success trying new ideas with the boss fights, but struggled to find good twists on Rocksteady's templates. This isn't a bad fight, but it's hard not to compare it to the much superior Mr. Freeze. It's far from the strong note the game could have ended on. After the fight, we learn that Bane's use of TN1 causes continuity-friendly memory loss. He's conveniently forgotten everything he learned about Batman's identity. That kind of thing is well within the bounds of comic book logic, but that doesn't prevent it from feeling like a cheat. Assuming that Bane returns to semi-normal brain function, and this seems to be supported by his appearances later in the timeline, what prevents him from using the same processes to rediscover Batman's identity? The problem with this subplot isn't that it's a plot hole so much, whatever that really means. The problem is that it cheapens the storytelling. For a story to have impact, the audience needs to believe the details of the plot have weight and meaning within the fiction. Batman's identity being compromised should be a huge deal, one of the biggest threats to Batman and his associates possible. This happened in the last game, and it was such a significant event that the only way to neatly tie up that loose end was to have Hugo Strange die. But there's no real cost or lasting consequence to this subplot from Origins. It doesn't notably inform Batman or Alfred's characterization going forward because it's a prequel. And particularly because it's a prequel made by a different creative team than the rest of the series. Mechanically, the back third of the game is great, but it's also where the narrative begins to struggle a bit, losing focus and getting sidetracked before the finale. The Bane plot goes off in one direction, while the Joker hangs out in the background as the true denouement. Arkham City had this same issue. The Protocol 10 Hugo Strange Ra's al Ghul plot came to an abrupt end, and then clumsily transitioned to the true and satisfying ending with the Joker. Neither plot integrated well with each other. At least in Origins, there's a clear cause and effect relationship between the villains, but not a thematic one. Overemphasizing Bane is one of the game's biggest flaws. It has such strong material for Batman, Alfred, Joker, and Gordon, all integral characters to the mythos. But Bane is elevated to the same level, despite not having that stature, importance, or thematic weight. He doesn't fit into this story in a complementary way like those other characters do. So while it's perfectly fine for him to show up as one of the assassins, he's not compelling as a recurring nemesis, at least not in this story. While Bane is the primary adversary in gameplay, the Joker is the real mastermind orchestrating events. Everything that happens in the story follows from his plan and his actions. Initially, I was annoyed about the Joker's inclusion in this game. After getting a terrific send-off in Arkham City, this seemed like a good time to give the character a rest and investigate some other corners of the mythos. For the first handful of hours, it seems like that's what Origins is doing. But then the Joker appears, upstaging everyone and hijacking the story. What a classic Joker move. Origins squandered its potential as a Joker-free Batman story, but including the Batman vs. Joker dynamic in all the games gave the Arkham saga a central through line. In Origins, they meet. Asylum exemplifies their ongoing battle of wits. In Arkham City, the Joker dies, and Arkham Knight deals with the repercussions of his death. Even if it wasn't intended throughout the production of the games, it unifies the series around something substantial. The most vital of Arkham Origins' narrative goals is establishing the relationship between hero and nemesis, and it does that incredibly well. Both experience major character growth. The events of the story change them profoundly. Joker is introduced as a mysterious force in Gotham. Before the game's events, Joker takes over the Black Mask persona, seizing Roman Sionis' seat atop his criminal empire and using the organization for his own nefarious purposes. Joker hires the assassins to kill Batman, murders Commissioner Loeb, and then wires a bunch of buildings to explode. Beyond that, his original endgame isn't clear, and that's pretty common with the Joker. Like Batman, Joker's malleability in the hands of different creators is a big reason for his pop culture longevity. I mean, what is the Joker? A nihilist? A narcissist? A gangster? A terrorist? Is he actually insane, or is that mostly an act? Does he have concrete motives, or does he merely delight in being the incarnation of chaotic evil? At various times, the answer to all of those has been yes. I think the only constant is that he's a great adversary for Batman. Whatever his plan was in Origins, everything changes when he comes face to face with his future nemesis. It's not their first encounter that does it. The Joker seems amused by Batman at their initial meeting, but not particularly interested. I think he underestimates Batman, assuming him to be a simple, brutish do-gooder, a grotesque extension of the justice system. In time, Batman proves himself to be something far different and far stranger to Joker. Midway through the game, as Bane flees the Gotham Royal Hotel, he takes a potshot at the Joker, who's thrown off the building to certain death. Without hesitation, Batman leaps after him and saves a man he knows to be remorselessly guilty of savage murder and mass destruction. This is the pivotal, defining moment for their dynamic. It isn't Batman's costume, gadgets, brooding persona, or combat prowess that gets Joker's attention. It's Batman's commitment to justice and compassion in equal measure that throws the Joker for a loop. He understands well why Batman is fighting him, but he's completely shocked that Batman would go out of his way to save his sorry life. Suddenly, Batman no longer fits neatly into the box Joker had assigned him, just as Joker doesn't fit into any of Batman's preconceived notions of criminality. What follows is one of the best pure storytelling sequences in the whole series. Joker is taken to Blackgate, where he meets Harleen Quinzel, who attempts to give him a psych evaluation. As the future couples speak, we get a look inside Joker's twisted mind with a playable sequence that takes us through distorted fragments of memory. Origins threads a tricky needle here with its exploration of Joker's backstory and inner life. Telling a Joker origin story is fraught for a variety of reasons. How do you adequately answer the question of where this maniac came from? How do you enhance rather than detract from the character's mystique with that kind of exploration? Giving the character a concrete origin story is anathema to many fans and creators. The most famous and influential story attempting to do that is Alan Moore and Brian Boland's 1988 graphic novel The Killing Joke. The Arkham series, being an amalgam of Batman's greatest hits, already canonized a version of The Killing Joke's events by depicting Barbara Gordon as Oracle in the first game. Here, the series leans on it again for the Joker's backstory. In The Killing Joke, his origin is shown through a series of flashbacks. They're depicted with as much detail as the present-day scenes. He's not telling his story to anyone. It's not a lie or a tall tale. These are either meant to be his memories or the actual events shown by the omniscient storyteller. At one point, the Joker comments that he can't exactly remember his past, which allows for the possibility that the flashbacks are unreliable. To me, that feels like a hedge against criticism from fans who dislike the idea of the character having a specific origin story. The intention of The Killing Joke with these flashback scenes is to provide a specific background for the character to illustrate the Joker's thesis that one bad day is all it takes for someone to be driven to madness like him. I think, in some ways, Origins actually handles the idea of a Joker backstory better than the venerated graphic novel. Here in the game, everything from Troy Baker's delivery, to the dreamlike logic of the level design, to the impressionistic lighting, clearly demonstrates that what we're seeing isn't reliable. These are Joker's memories, partially real, partially distorted, partially twisted. We move through vignettes from his time as a failed comedian, to falling in with the mob, and finally his fateful encounter with Batman and a vat of chemicals that marred his visage forever. You can interpret this sequence as a loose adaptation of The Killing Joke's events, or as a more abstract representation of the Joker's own self-mythologizing. It does a much better job of informing the audience about the character's psyche without demystifying him with a concrete origin story. Whatever actually happened, it's clear that Joker blames Batman for his transformation. In his mind, Batman created him, fought him, and then saved his life so he could do it all over again. Now Joker enthusiastically embraces his role in this cycle. It's sick, but it gives him some sense of belonging and purpose. This sequence does so much to inform the audience, but the one that follows, delving into Batman's perspective, is arguably superfluous. It presents old information in the same old way. There's no new insights, and not even a new aesthetic treatment for the material. A different approach would have been more effective, and provided a better contrast between how these characters remember and process their pasts. It didn't have to be a complicated scene either. This is a natural lull in the story. It would have been a good time for Bruce to catch his breath, take off the cowl, maybe eat something as Alfred keeps insisting. Maybe his thoughts drift back to Christmases past. Even just a quick glance at an old photo or a family portrait would have done the job without overdoing it. Something besides the same old flashback to Crime Alley would probably have been better here. Despite being locked up, the Joker isn't done. Now his obsession is fixed on Batman, messing with him, challenging him, and testing his limits to see what he'll do. He's already correctly ascertained that Batman won't kill, so he devises an elaborate no-win scenario to force Batman to choose between his life and his ideals. This is the context around the second Bane fight. Batman must choose to either kill Bane, or, if he lets him live, his heartbeat will charge a device connected to an electric chair which will fry the Joker. Either Batman, Bane, or the Joker will die. Once again, the shock gloves seem to solve all the life or death problems in this story. Batman uses them to stop Bane's heart for just long enough to fool the Joker, and then revives Bane, leading to the final fight. There's a little bit of falling action after Bane goes down, including a small melee where Batman and Gordon work together for the first time. It's a great little moment. Not every game has to end on its big boss fight, and in terms of character work, Origins has more left to do. The final Joker encounter is more of an interactive cinematic than an actual fight. The intent of the scene is great, but the execution is a little off. Joker tries to goad Batman into killing him, but Batman maintains control and subdues the clown non-lethally. This plays out through a series of spectacularly violent beatdowns that sort of run counter to the intention of the scene. Even in the comic booky reality of the Arkhamverse, Joker takes an awful lot of punches, and it sure seems like Batman is starting to lose control here. If the point was to show restraint, Batman could have stopped the Joker with a gadget or some other method. He could have used his brain in addition to his fists, like he did when resolving the Joker's scheme to make him kill. For the player, too, the idea of restraint is non-existent. It's a quick time event that asks you to mash the strike button to your heart's content. Ultimately, this moment is really about Batman and Gordon, not Batman and Joker. Gordon notes that his guys would have just killed the clown, but Batman has shown Gordon that's not how he operates. Gordon still views him as an outlaw. He's not quite ready to throw in with the Dark Knight, but his mind is well on its way to being changed. He's seen that Batman, although outside the law, respects the most essential parts of the law. He's here to serve and protect, and he's doing a better job of that than most of the people wearing badges. Joker represents anarchy and chaos, because ultimately he sees no purpose and no meaning to anything. Life is a cruel joke, and he wants the last laugh. Batman is his opposite because, in the face of darkness, decay, and despair, he chooses to believe that things can be better, even when it seems like he's alone in that assertion. In the end, Origins gets right what so many of the best Batman stories do, that Batman's ultimate triumph isn't as a symbol of vengeance or fear or justice, but hope. If there's one area that Arkham Origins definitively outdoes its predecessor, it's the DLC. Cold Cold Heart is a much better addition than Arkham City received with Harley Quinn's Revenge. This is an adaptation of Heart of Ice, one of the best-loved episodes of Batman the Animated Series. Heart of Ice rewrote the origin story of Mr. Freeze, transforming him from a dimensionless bad guy originally called Mr. Zero into a character with real pathos. In the episode, Victor Freeze is a tragic figure. He's a cryogenicist who puts his terminally ill wife on ice until a cure for her condition is found. When his employer tries to turn off the cryogenic equipment as a cost-cutting measure, Freeze intervenes and is caught in a lab accident. Afterwards, he's no longer able to survive outside of sub-zero temperatures. He builds himself a cold suit, an ice gun, and vows revenge against his employer. Cold Cold Heart uses the basic elements of that story, but modifies the structure to function inside the Arkham gameplay framework. Some of the changes are improvements, though others undercut the emotional impact of the original version. It's a good mini-campaign, though. There are enough new elements to make it a novel and worthwhile extra. Compressed into a story that lasts only a few hours, the additions end up feeling like just as much innovation as the main game achieved. There's a new bat suit for extreme temperatures. It grants thermal abilities, allowing Batman to break through thick ice, or throw heated batarangs that can be used to drop icicles on enemies. Reused environments are balanced out by entirely new ones. Most of the playtime is spent in these new locations, starting with Wayne Manor. Mr. Freeze's mercenaries attack during an event at the mansion, where GothCorp CEO Ferris Boyle is receiving a philanthropic award. As Bruce Wayne, you have to fight your way to the Batcave. It's a more involved Bruce Wayne sequence than in Arkham City. Even though the free-flow controls are the same, there's a notable feeling of vulnerability that comes from not having access to gadgets, the Batsuit, and especially detective mode. There's even a little bit of stealth you have to do without any of Batman's fancy tools. After you suit up and rescue some party guests, there's this cute moment where Batman and Alfred have to pretend not to know each other. Stuff like that makes this unique change of setting and scenario a lot of fun, and it goes a long way toward adding dimension and humanity to the characters. The bulk of the gameplay takes place inside GothCorp headquarters, as Batman uncovers the reason why Mr. Freeze kidnapped Ferris Boyle. Boyle is Freeze's unscrupulous former employer, the one who tried to unplug Nora Freeze and caused the lab accident. In the animated series, Batman watches a recording of these events. Victor gets to explain himself in his own words. Origins gamifies this revelation. It's presented as a crime scene investigation sequence. That's a good idea in theory. Starting from the available evidence in the room, you trace events backward in time until the full picture is revealed. In contrast to the episode, this is a cold, clinical approach that loses the emotional focus on Victor and Nora. Framing events from Freeze's perspective created empathy for the character. Here, these people are reduced to holographic reconstructions while Batman narrates what happened. It doesn't have nearly the same impact. It's otherwise a decent adaptation of the original story. One change I prefer is that in the Origins version, Freeze was working for Boyle on a secret weapons development project in exchange for GothCorp dedicating some resources to find a cure for Nora. This establishes some shades of gray in Freeze even before he puts on the suit, which makes his villainous turn feel more natural. Boyle is less cartoonish as well. In the animated series, Bruce Wayne meets with Boyle and has this real mask-off conversation, where Boyle smugly admits that he doesn't care about philanthropy beyond its PR value. In the game, Boyle hides his true character. That makes the revelation more impactful for Bruce Wayne, who'd hoped that he and Boyle were aligned in their goals of making the city a better place. In that way, Cold Cold Heart continues the themes of the main story, exploring the impact of events on Batman as he searches for more allies. Not content with trying to emulate Rocksteady's Mr. Freeze boss in the main game, WB Montreal takes a second bite at the apple here at the conclusion of the DLC. Phase 1 of the fight is a unique twist on the stealth boss formula. The arena is crawling with standard enemies, while Freeze overlooks the room on a raised platform in the center, actively searching for Batman. Normally, you can't be spotted on overhangs and tightropes above enemies, but Freeze threatens this safe harbor. If you enter his line of sight, he'll attack and alert his henchmen. The objective in this phase is to disable cryo-reactors around the room. This leaves you completely vulnerable to attack, so you have to choose your moments carefully. It's a solid test of the player's stealth skills. Phase 2 is where Origins tries to replicate the Arkham City fight, but comes up short. The original Mr. Freeze boss encounter was simple and focused. It was just you and this creepy robot voice man locked in a room. Freeze hunted you slowly, relentlessly, like the Terminator. It forced players to use different types of stealth takedowns while evading a dangerous enemy, without some of the normal Predator mode crutches. Origins has an over-elaborate, over-designed version of the same basic thing. In addition to Freeze himself, there are still standard enemies in the mix, which would make things more tense and difficult, except that the arena is so much larger. It's filled with easy ways to break lines of sight and escape from any trouble you might get into. Freeze tries to limit your tactical options by icing things up, but you can undo this with Batman's thermal equipment. So unlike the Arkham City fight, where the net tightens with each successful takedown, Origins allows you to repeat tactics and keep your mobility options open, which diminishes a lot of tension, challenge, and satisfaction compared to its predecessor. DLC is a good place to get experimental, but instead, Origins goes back to the well. As the game does so often, it lifts something from the Rocksteady games without understanding how to improve upon it, other than presentationally. It's a shame the DLC ends this way because the new mechanics and locations are generally very good. This fight encapsulates why Origins as a game isn't as respected as its fellows. It takes fewer risks with original ideas and claims fewer and less extravagant rewards for its caution. Does Batman Arkham Origins deserve its reputation as the worst game in the series? I suppose something has to be the worst. And if it does, this game is probably the best candidate from the mainline titles. Origins certainly has some bad moments and silly story beats, but that's true of every Arkham game, and these flaws aren't particularly worse here than elsewhere. After a reevaluation, I can't definitively say that it's substantially lacking in quality compared to the others. It has its own unique strengths. It more than justifies its existence in terms of narrative weight, tonal distinctiveness, and quality gameplay exemplified by its largely excellent boss fights. Origins has been unfairly maligned. In a way, it's been retroactively edited out of the conversation about the series. The other games received ports, updates, and reissues. They're considered part of the trilogy, which ignores Origins entirely. Whether that's because of internal publisher politics, a perceived lack of value or quality, or some other reason entirely, I'm not sure. I know that Origins wasn't exactly part of Rocksteady's vision, but it seems wrong to just pretend that it doesn't exist, as though it's some kind of blight on the series. You can't deny that it's ultimately the product of a corporate mandate to exploit the franchise's popularity, but it was still crafted by a team that wanted to make something great. To act like that isn't the case is not only ignorant, it's disrespectful. Sandwiched between the higher priority Rocksteady releases, WB Montreal was probably never in a position to make their game all that it could have been. Each of the Rocksteady games had the space to be something special. Origins was only allowed to be a product. And yet the efforts and talent of the team behind it shine bright anyway. It's a very solid product. I do wonder about that theoretical version of the game though. What if Arkham Origins had enough time and budget to realize the full ambitions of the team? Maybe the worst Arkham game could have been one of the best. But then again, the worst Arkham game is still pretty good.